Let's go ahead and dive into DISC. DISC is one of the most popular assessments used in the workforce, especially the North American based workforce. Um, Part of why when Sherry and I started Indigo, we wanted to make sure to utilize the DISC assessment is because DISC helps us understand not only ourselves, but also team and group dynamics when we're working with other people. So when you look at this graph, the graph goes from 0 to 100, and this 50 line in the middle is the energy line. So bars that go above the 50, we're going to talk about as being high. Bars that stay below the 50, we're going to talk about as being low. High is not good and low is not bad. There's no right or wrong combination of scores or score in general. Instead, this graph is designed to help us better understand which of these 8 styles are our natural style, how we can understand those environments that we will thrive in, and how we can also understand those styles different from us so that we can really engage and interact in work groups, in student groups, and better understand not only ourselves, but better understand those that may have a different style than we do. As we start to describe these, we're really going to describe them more in the extreme. So as you look at your DISC graph, how many of you have at least one bar over 70? I know I do. I'm going to go back to mine actually. Yep. So as we start to describe these high indicators, if when you look at your bar, that bar is over 70, chances are many of the descriptors that we use will feel true for you. If you have a bar that's over 50 but not over 70, chances are it could feel true for you, but maybe not as extreme, or maybe it's more situational for you. The same is true on the low side. How many of you have at least one bar under 30? Yep. So very similar to what I described before. As we start to give descriptors of these low styles, if you have a bar under 30, chances are many of these descriptors can feel true for you. If your score is between 30 and 50, it may feel true, but maybe not as extreme, or it could feel more situational for you. Does anyone have all 4 bars between 30 and 70? If you do, this is a really unique style. It's part of why we call it out. Oh, there's a couple. So for those of you that do have all 4 bars in the middle, you tend to be the most flexible and adaptable of all of us. So just as we described, if you have one bar in that sort of 30 to 70 range, it can feel less extreme for you, or maybe you're able to shift between the high and low style depending on the situation. For those of us that have very high and very low bars, we don't adjust and adapt to the other style very well. And we definitely don't do so without much stress and exhaustion to us personally. So the beauty of the bridge style is that you really can adapt and adjust your style as needed, much more fluidly and much more authentically than those of us who have high and low bars. When we see this in young people, so I know some people on our call today work with students in primary schools, and not primary, in secondary schools. And so when we are working with younger people, sometimes when we see the bridge style in them, it is because they will be flexible, adaptable adults as well. They're just not very extreme in their style. And sometimes in young people, we see this because they're just still figuring themselves out. And so they didn't respond very extremely because they are still, as I said, figuring themselves out. And you could see some shifts in their disc bars over time. For most adults, people who have been in the workforce at least 5 years, the shift in disc over time is typically not very extreme. Meaning most of the time we get to understand and we essentially are who we are. Of course, we can adjust to situations and environments as they're needed, but our natural style typically stays true to who we are over time. And when we talk about shifts and changes, we're really just talking about those changes of 20 points or more. So if you see a shift over time and your disc, say your I bar changed by about 10 points, this isn't typically considered a significant shift or a change. It's really those changes in point values that are 20 points or higher. Before I move forward, any questions about reading the graph or shifts over time? Just want to open this up to any questions if there are any. Okay. If you do have one, please feel free to put it in the chat, put a hand up on the screen. I'm happy to stop where I'm going and take any questions as they do come up. So here's a quick video to help describe the red bar. On your reports, it'll say that the red bar stands for dominance. I also like to describe it as directness. When we created these videos, we were really intentional. These are not actors. These are people in the education field who have taken our assessment. They could be teachers, they could be facilitators, they could be students. And as you see their disc graphs, these are really theirs. And so those that are describing the low styles, you'll see that their scores are under 30. Those are that are describing the high styles, you'll see that their scores are over 70. And we also put some pretty intentional music in the background. So let's see what you observe.
It's not about a competition for me. It's not about like, I want to be on top. I'm not making people do things. I don't like to tell people what to do, but if folks are down and to be part of a team and the team needs structure and guidance and leadership, I am good at that. Unless you've got something really you feel strongly one way or another, I'm happy to share my thoughts, and people are usually like, oh, that's good.
My name is Tay, and I have high dominance. The time I experienced competitiveness is when I ran for Colorado Boy State Governor. I used grit, and I never gave up. And then when I feel like somebody's better than me, then I gotta be better than them, so it's more competitiveness. Jobs that involve power. Jobs that involve impact and power in my community.
Okay, so with the disc styles, as I said earlier, there is no right or wrong, and all of these styles have both benefits and downfalls. But the truth is they are quite different from each other. So high Ds tend to be more direct in the way that they communicate. The higher the D, the more this is true. Sometimes you'll find that just open mouth, out come the words in an unfiltered, really direct, straightforward way. High Ds like communicating that way. It helps them share their opinions. They just say what's on their mind. And they're also typically pretty driven, and they like to just get things done. And so the way they communicate helps support those goals. Low Ds, on the other hand, tend to be less direct in the way that they communicate. They tend to use a thicker filter, They really tend to think before they speak, mostly because they're concerned about the impact. And many low Ds often take longer in order to come to those decisions. Why is this? Well, part of it has to do with their leadership styles. Both high and low Ds can be great leaders, but their style looks different. High Ds tend to be rather directive in how they are a leader, whereas low D individuals tend to lead more from consensus and through collaboration. Both of these styles are really important and valuable. And as I said, they just show up very differently. When we consider this high D style, what might be some other descriptors, or how else might you describe this communication style? I gave you a handful, but how else might you describe how you perceive, or maybe as a high D, how you choose to communicate? Any other ideas? Yeah, that's a great one. Iris, I love that you went to results oriented, because it's really the goal and the main goal behind the reason why they communicate. Yes, that they can be direct, and they often do communicate in shorter sentences or shorter bursts. That's part of what direct is, or to the point. They can be kind of demanding, like just sort of cutting to the chase, asking the question, not making excuses for themselves or others. I love this. How else? So let's go to the opposite side. How else might you describe the low D communication style, especially as it comes to like how this low D style can also be a great leader? How might you see that differently? Yeah, there's an approachability. I would agree. Yes, lots of collaborative or collaboration. I saw someone else that said listening. Low Ds do tend to listen longer. And so there's a friendliness, and potentially can be perceived as more emotional intelligence. There is a desire for harmony, right? They don't want to rock the boat or create conflict where it might not be necessary. Yeah, great descriptors. And again, my goal is for us to really understand and believe that both of these styles are valuable and important. They're just different. And so also by describing them each with even more descriptors that you've given, hopefully it helps us to understand more, not only our own style, but also potentially styles that are different from ours. All right. Let's move on to the I. I stands for influencing. But I also like to refer to it as interactions, specifically people interactions.
Hi, I'm Matt. I'm low influencing. Parties are not my favorite unless it's like a bunch of people I know really well. I actually like working with groups if they're, again, people I know or people I've worked with before. That said, a lot of what I do is me sitting at a computer alone working on things.
I'm Austin, and I'm very high influencing. Oh, if I was cheering for a game, I'm the guy with his shirt off with the paint and going crazy. That's what I'm doing. I'm getting wild. Yeah, absolutely. With every teacher that I've ever had in college, I've always reached out to and always talked to after class. with friends, I always like to be the one that's kind of outspoken, kind of the person that you want to shove and say, all right, man, let me talk up.
Okay, so there is a level of talkativeness that can describe some of the differences between the high and low I's. There's also potentially a sense of not only talkativeness, but again, in that interaction, how many people we may want to interact with in a day, and what is our people capacity before reaching exhaustion. So for high I's, we tend to be more talkative, and we tend to potentially get energy being around other people. We are the people. Low I's, on the other hand, depending on how low the I is, they tend to like to keep the circle a bit smaller, because sometimes too many people is just overwhelming and exhausting. And so this is important for us to keep in mind, not only for ourselves as we're looking into what's the best possible, say, work scenario for us, but also as we are interacting with students and those that we are coaching or advising. When you think about your people capacity, this is something really important to consider. We can all be any style along this spectrum that I've just described, as far as being very people oriented and wanting to be around lots of people, or preferring really small or one-on-one groups, or maybe just wanting to work all on your own. We can all do any of that. But the question becomes, for how long, at what cost, and for what purpose? One of the beauties of being human is that we can adapt. We can change our style. We can adjust who we are in a certain situation. But first of all, knowing who we naturally are is important, so that we know when we adjust, that we can start to understand its impact on us. And many times that first impact that we notice is exhaustion. I'm a pretty high I. If you saw my score, I'm up in the 80s. And when I spend too much time by myself and not interacting with other people, I lose some of my energy. It is a bit more exhausting to me. There could be others of you who feel the opposite, like, actually, I really just like being in a small group. And if there's too many people, that's too exhausting. It's good to keep in mind. For those of you that work with students, it's also noteworthy that the difference in the high and low I often also describes a difference in how we learn, because high I's are external processors. We learn sort of out here externally. So we learn by talking, we learn by listening, and sometimes we learn by listening to the words that come out of our own mouths when we start talking. So really high I's, if you ask them a question and they don't know the answer, they often just start talking. It's that external processing that happens. Low I's, on the other hand, are internal processors. They do all of that sort of conversation and debate and processing in their own minds. They typically want longer to process those thoughts, and often wonder why all the high I's are talking so much in the first place. Any thoughts or questions around understanding or describing this I style? Quick question out to the group. How many of you are high I's? So how many of you have that I score over 50? Yeah, I see quite a few coming in. Some hands on the screen. Thank you. Yeah. Part of why over time I continue to host these by Zoom. First of all, is because I'm a high I, so I want to talk about it with all of you. Many of you here are also higher I's, which means you want to be able to listen to it live, potentially ask any questions, or have the potential for engagement, even if the engagement is through the chat channel versus just listening to a recording. I also saw somebody post something in the chat asking about or questioning, say, a correlation between D and I scores or indicators. So there actually is no true correlation between any of the 4 scores, meaning if you are a high D, does this mean that you will necessarily be a high D or a high I or a low I? Essentially, the answer is yes. You could be either. There isn't necessarily a distinct correlation. We do see some patterns, but the truth is you could be any combination or any pattern. So better understanding each of them could better also help you understand, again, not only yourself, but what you might be observing and seeing in those around you. When it comes to trends in the education space, this is the vast majority of the work that Indigo does. We don't necessarily see a trend in the I, but we do see a significant trend in the D score. So the average D for educators. So educators can fall in the realm of teachers, counselors, tutors, mentors, specifically those that are working hands-on in schools directly with students. The average D score is 40. This is pretty low. Well, it's averagely low, I guess. It might also be worth noting that one of the most disciplined behaviors of students is the high D style. And I think part of that comes from the communication disconnect and the misunderstanding that happens between those 2 distinctly different styles. For the I, we see the whole range of I scores in educators. You could potentially look back even at your own time in education and consider those teachers that you remember were a bit more quiet or maybe less animated in class versus those really enthusiastic and expressive teachers tended to be your higher I. You really see that the I there is less of a trend. Any other thoughts or questions so far? All right, then let's talk about the S. So as we said, each of the scores, we've been talking about them as if they're in their individual silos, because it is easier to understand these new concepts when we break them down individually. There is an interesting relationship, however, between the S and the C. So when both the S and the C, which are the 2 we're going to talk about next, when those are both above the midline, so when they're both over 50, they tend to amplify each other and show up in your own life and communication style and the way you like to operate. They will show up for you as if they're even higher than your graph may suggest. If they're both below the line, they also tend to amplify each other as if they show up for you as if they're even lower than your graph might suggest. Now, if instead you have one above the line and one below the line, it doesn't matter which one. Does anyone have that combination where you have either the S or the C, one's above the line and one's below? If this is true for you, as we did, what happens is you tend to pick and choose from the next 4 styles that I'm going to describe. So we're about to talk about the high S, the low S, the high C, and the low C. And if you have one of your bars above the line and one below, regardless of which one it is, you may still pick from each of these 4, and either that will be true for you most of the time, all the time, or you could really flex between all 4 of these styles situationally, as if you had those bars right in the middle. I described this in the beginning because sometimes as we start to describe the S, if this is true for you that you have one above the line and below the line, we go into these descriptors and you think to yourself, I think my report might be wrong. I feel like I have a high S on my page, but when I look at this low S style, that feels more like me. That could be true for you. And again, you're really going to be the only one that knows when you're that high, when you have one above and one below the line, how these show up for you. So it's why I like to describe it before we even get started. And if this is not making sense to you yet, give it a little more time. Let's get through the S and the C descriptors and take questions or talk about it further on the other side. So the S stands for steadiness. I also like to refer to it as sameness. And how you might feel when I say it's about when things are the same might also help describe for you which side of this high and low S you tend to fall on.
My name is Chantel, and I am very low steadiness. I like things to change. Like, I like for every day I show up to look a little different than the day before. I've quit jobs because they do the exact same thing. The only thing I can think of is like maybe a surgeon, like a trauma surgeon or something like that, but I don't really like blood, so that kind of makes my stomach hurt thinking about that. Maybe a police officer? I don't know. An EMT? That's still blood. I can't think of anything.
My name is Isaiah. I'm very high steadiness. We're always constantly improvising, and it makes me feel very flabbergasted. Because you wouldn't expect that from me because I'm the youngest. But I'm also the tallest and the cutest.
Okay, so high S styles tend to be really patient and predictable people. And the higher your S, the more this is potentially true for you. And especially that combination of both the S and the C being over the line. We like our routines. We like predictability. We like to know what's going to be happening. And we have a pace that we like to work at. And with that pace, we don't want to be rushed or pushed to have to work faster, but we also don't want anyone to get in our way to slow us down. There's just this pace and this, we just get in the flow and don't want anything to interrupt that flow. Low S's, on the other hand, tend to be your variety is the spice of life kind of people. They want things to be a little bit different, to do things a bit differently. Too much of the same can feel very boring and can also really stifle their creativity. Low S's are looking to change it up, try something new, There is a sense of innovation that comes in this low S style of wanting to potentially do things differently. There's also a different sort of kinetic energy around the differences between high and low S's. High S's tend to have a very calm energy and just that internal sort of kinetic energy. We're able to sit still for longer, maybe work from a desk for a longer period of time or from the same space. Low S's, on the other hand, have a much higher kinetic energy. They need to move. They struggle to sit still. I know that this is one of those indicators where my co-founder Sherry and I are very different. I'm a very high S. You're looking at the place that I work from most days. It's in this chair, at this desk, in this room. Sherry tends to work best from a treadmill desk. She needs to be moving in order to keep her mind focused on what she's trying to do. Sitting still is a recipe for disaster for Sherry, and it really just stifles her creativity and really her ability to get things done in the way that she likes to. And so it's, again, important to keep in mind which of these styles really feels true for you. This is another one of those indicators where we do see a trend in education, and the average S score for educators, again, educators are going to be those teachers, counselors, mentors, assistants, those that are working hands-on with students on a regular basis. Their S score has an average of 70. It makes sense if you think about part of the industry that they've self-selected into, which has a lot of routines embedded in it, right? When you think about the school year, there are patterns. What time of year do you start? Then I know here in the US, for instance, we start in the fall, then we have Thanksgiving break and winter break and spring break, and you get the summer off. Like, there's a pattern, there's a routine to that happens every year. This is also when we consider, especially like in the US, when we look at our school districts as a whole, this is also one of the main places where we get some communication disconnects between the educators or the in the building working with the students group and the leadership teams. Because leadership teams tend to have lower S scores, right? They want to potentially change the way things are happening. They're looking for improvements. They're looking to innovate. They're looking to not necessarily do things the same way. And sometimes this can create some conflict and some communication disconnects. So again, just something to really keep in mind. Yeah. Thoughts or questions on the S? All right. Then let's talk about the C. The C stands for compliance. I also like to refer to it as conscientiousness.
My name is Uche, and I'm low compliance. I'm more of a visionary, so sometimes I don't really honor the process. Rules, I'm just like, if there's a way to get by it or find a loophole, that works.
Can I go now? Sure, go ahead. Okay. My name is Luis. I am high compliance. I'd rather spare all the conflict that comes from breaking the rules. Without rules, it's kind of all over the place, and for me, I don't deal well with chaos. But I do make sure every little thing is done correctly. Am I allowed to interact with Uche?
So we left that last question on there because it's a pretty classic high C question or statement. High Cs would tend to prefer to ask for permission versus forgiveness. And low Cs will ask for forgiveness for days. They'll try it, they'll wing it, they'll break it, they'll fix it, they'll do it all over again. High Cs tend to be really detail-oriented people. Again, they believe there is a right way of doing things, and they want to do things the right way. There is a high quality work that comes from the high Cs, and depending on how high the C, this tendency to be a bit of a perfectionist about the work that you do, again, being really precise and exacting and conscientious about that. Low Cs, on the other hand, they tend to be more big picture thinkers. Again, this is a place where innovation comes from, because sometimes low C thinkers are so far outside the box, you wonder where the box even is. They are inventing and creating things that have never been thought of. And they're also really good with changing plans. And like when things don't go the way they think, they'll like come up with a new plan, or they'll find a different way of doing it. And they're much more concerned with the final result than the actual process it may take to get there. So especially now for those of you that may have had one of those bars above the line and one below the line for the S and C, is this starting to make sense for you about your results and which of these scores are true for you? Are there any questions, or would you like for me to describe that phenomenon again? Before I leave this section, I just want to make sure, I just want to check and see if anyone had any questions on that. Okay. Then let me back up and ask in general with DISC. So we've now gone through describing all 8 styles, which fall on the high and low side of each of the 4 columns. We personally are a combination of each of those scores for ourselves, their intensities, as well as just our own personal experience and how we lend our own personality styles to those. Does anyone have any questions about reading or understanding the DISC graph, or how you might describe that to yourself? I just want to open it up for DISC questions in general. Great question about the DISC scores changing over time. So typically if I were to consider a group of adults meaning they are, say, 5 years into their chosen career pathway, if you are taking DISC at that time in your life, chances are your DISC is pretty stable and determined, right? It probably is not going to change much over time. And again, remember, when we talk about change, we're talking about differences of 20 points or more. Where we see the most likelihood of change, actually, let me back up a second. There will be some of us who have extreme bars. Let me go back to my own graph. There will be some of us with some extreme bars, either the extremely high or the extremely low. Chances are these could very well be things that have been true for us the vast majority of our lives. And this is also the place where we have the least likelihood to change. This is pretty decided. It's pretty extreme. Extreme is not a bad thing. It is just we are decisively who we are. Where there is the most opportunity for change is in those bars in the middle. And the closer they are to that 50 line, sometimes the more they can change over time. But again, remember, true change is 20 points or more. And we may also see change in younger people who have more of those bars in the middle. They may either, some of those bars may stay in the middle for them long term, or they could become more extreme to one side or the other of the disc graph. It's a great question, but especially those of us that have bars over 70 and bars under 30, the likelihood of those changing over time is small. I'll leave it there. It's small.